My name is Tom Gallagher. I'm chair of the local chapter of Progressive Democrats of America, and I want to welcome you here tonight. In a nutshell, Progressive Democrats is a group that believes in trying to maintain high ideals and keeping its feet on the floor, on the ground at the same time. We are neither committed to staying outside of electoral politics. We are committed to being inside it, nor are we committed to taking the lead from what comes out of the White House or whoever happens to be in power. So that's a course that we try and maintain. It's not always an easy one to do. What we have been doing in recent months, in the last year or so now, is having a series of what we think have been excellent speakers on the fourth Thursday of each month, and you're here for the latest in that. And I'm going to, in a few minutes, turn you over to Shirley Golub. Ah, yes, she is in the back of the room. I thought she had disappeared. The chapter secretary, who will actually MC the event.
Okay, let's introduce our great speakers for the night. Michael Eisenscher has been a national coordinator, is a national coordinator of U.S. Labor Against the War, and a veteran of more than 40 years in the labor movement as an organizer, negotiator, labor education, and writer. And he helped to found the New Priorities Network nationally and the New Priorities campaign in the Bay Area. He has articles about the labor movement, published in 3 anthologies, and he teaches a course in political economy and labor at Laney College, Labor Studies program. He is on my far left, and you are far left, aren't you? All right, and
in my proper place.
And our other speaker is Jack Rasmus, who I'm
the centrist in the group.
The centrist, yes, right. An author. He's got his PhD. He's a journalist, a playwright. Some of his recent books are Obama's Economy, Recovery for the Few, Epic Recession, Prelude to Global Depression, and he hosts a weekly New York radio show, Alternative Visions. So we're going to let each of the gentlemen have about 20-25 minutes to talk, and then we're going to open it to the floor for questions.
All right, so let's talk about Social Security and Medicare, which means we want to talk about what's going on right now in Washington and the sequestered cuts, right? The $1.2 trillion over 10 years that they decided last August 11th, 2011 to put off to January 1st. Fiscal cliff, January 1st, kick it down the road 2 more months, and now it's March 1st, and we got this situation tomorrow. What does this have to do with Social Security and Medicare? Well, Social Security and Medicare, particularly Medicare, are the main targets of all of this deficit cutting that's been going on well, since 2010, essentially. I have a chapter in my book here, Obama's Economy, Chapter 7, which is all about deficit cutting from 2009 up until 2012, called Deficit Cutting on the Road to Double Dip Recession. What have been the positions of the main protagonists in this deficit cutting all along? Well, it all starts with Simpson-Bowles, this deficit commission that Obama put together right as soon as he got in office. As soon as he passed his first recovery bill, $787 billion stimulus, he put together this committee, Simpson-Bowles. Who were Simpson-Bowles? Simpson, a very arch-conservative Wyoming ex-senator, I mean really conservative, and Erskine Bowles, who was a staff person for Clinton, Bill Clinton, when Clinton was president, and Erskine Bowles, of course, is an investment banker before and after. Okay, so these are the guys who are going to set the tone for all this deficit cutting, the latest version of which we're just experiencing here tomorrow. And by the way, it's not over. There's going to be another deadline date on March 27 when the government runs out of money. There's going to be another debt ceiling date, May 18th. And then there's going to be, even later in the year, another punch-up when we start talking about big tax cuts for corporations and changing the entire tax code. So that sort of rolling deficit-cutting crisis in 2011 that the politicians both kicked down the road for the election year, talked about other things, phony things, and now immediately after the November elections, here comes the deficit cutting right back again. Simpson-Bowles put together the template for all this. In one way or another, where they're all discussing what part of Simpson-Bowles should we implement. Should we implement tax hikes? Should we implement cuts in Social Security and Medicare? Should we implement other discretionary spending cuts? They're all in agreement, $4 trillion got to be cut. There's no disagreement on that, just the question of whether it's going to be taxes or spending, and if it's spending, is it defense and non-defense, and if it's taxes, is it on the 2% or the rest of us? You know, they're all in agreement about it because they say we have this tremendous deficit. Well, if you look at the deficit, you know, the deficits and the debt, we've run up about $10 trillion since 2000, since the year 2000, $10 trillion. But if you're going to cut the deficit, you ought to identify the areas that were responsible for the run-up and focus on those. That's kind of logical, isn't it? Well, in my book, I have a table there, the 8 real causes of the deficit and the debt. All right, what are the real causes of why we ran up $10 trillion? First of all, is war, inflationary war spending, inflationary. If the Defense Department, the Pentagon, had simply increased defense spending the same as all the other prices, the Consumer Price Index for the 10 years, 2%, right? Instead of the 8.2% compounded every year, that was the defense increase, we would have saved $2.1 trillion of that $10 trillion. So just inflationary defense spending for 10 years is responsible to $2 trillion of that $10 trillion. Okay, what's the next item? The next big item is the Bush tax cuts, $3.4 trillion over a decade, 80% of which go to the wealthiest 20% in corporations. And most of that, 80%, goes to the top 1% and 5%. All right, $3.4 trillion in tax cuts. What else? Bailouts and stimulus, about $2 trillion. What else? Multinational corporations shuffling their profits offshore and refusing to bring them back and repatriate them and pay, you know, through the whole decade. That's about another $800 billion. Lost tax revenue because we have this deep, deep recession that we're still not over yet in terms of the job market. We still have over 20 million people unemployed. We've had over 20 to 27 million for 5 years now. They're not paying taxes. And businesses that would have hired them and produced things, they're not paying as much taxes either. So the fact that you don't have job recovery is a big reason why you have a loss of tax revenue. You see, you put the Bush tax cuts and the lost tax revenue, and then you put $1.5 trillion in tax cuts that were part of this stimulus, and 60% of the whole $10 trillion run-up is, guess what? Revenue problems. It's a lack of tax revenue. It's not too much spending, it's tax revenue. That's the big problem. And then we have medical cost inflation. You know, the government pays for Medicare, Medicaid, so forth. If we have double-digit health care costs every year, well, you know, just like us, the government has this huge health care bill that runs up. And of course, we passed the prescription drug bill in 2005, and we don't fund it at all. We don't pass any tax to fund prescription drugs. Over $500 billion since 2005. No tax. Well, it's all got to come out of deficits, which means it's all part contributing to debt, you see. Part B, Part A, Medicare, hospitalization and doctors. Big run-up in costs. Big run-up in costs that cost the government. And finally, interest on the debt. There's $10 trillion. I just rattled off to you $10 trillion in costs. Now, you think we would focus on those things as the reason. Now, by the way, except for Part D, prescription drugs, you know, it's not that retirees on Medicare are getting better and better benefits and coverage on Medicare. That has nothing to do with it at all. It's all a question of cost run-ups on all this. Now, we recently had this fiscal cliff, you know, thing that happened on January 1st. And the big settlement was $60 billion a year. We're going to raise taxes on the wealthy. Right, $60 billion. Obama was saying, oh, it's going to be We're going to tax the 2%. Well, we tax the top 0.7 of 1% with that. A little bit, 60 billion. Okay. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that if we let all of the Bush tax cuts go through over this next decade, it would cost us another $4.6 trillion in deficits. So we cut out 600 billion and we let 4 trillion go through, right? And that's why we're facing now over the next decade $7 trillion of total additional deficit and debt, 7 trillion. Well, 4 trillion of that are the Bush tax cuts and the fact we can't get the economy going again. On January 1st, we had this fiscal cliff. You know, we settled the tax side of this, quote, 60 billion, that's all. And Obama said, well, you know, that's only the beginning. We're going to come back and get some more tax hikes out of these rich folks. And of course, the Republicans in Congress, in the House said, oh, no way. You know, we're all through with tax hikes. You know, everything from now on is going to be spending cuts. That's it. And they're holding firm to that. Obama made a big strategic error. You know, what he could have done was to say, let the fiscal cliff happen. And then 24 hours later, we, the Democrats, could have put another bill in Congress just to cut the taxes on the middle class. And that meant that the Republicans would have been in a position of voting against a tax cut for the middle class. You know, their rich folks would have been left out, but they would have been, but instead, they settled for the small settlement of just 60 billion, put themselves, the administration, behind the 8 ball. And now what we've got is just the opposite occurring. Just the opposite, right? What are the Republicans saying? They're saying, let's go over the sequester cliff here, right? Let's let the $85 billion, 48 billion of which is defense, all occur. But watch, they'll turn right around within a week and they'll introduce a bill to restore the defense spending only. So they're doing what Obama should have done with taxes. They're doing with defense, you see. The Democrats, excuse me, I know this is a Democrat meeting, but they're getting outmaneuvered time and time again. That's the problem. The Republicans are much tougher negotiators, I'm sad to say. Okay. So far, we've gotten $1 trillion in spending cuts only, $1 trillion in August 2011. Agreed to cut spending by $1 trillion. What did we get for that? Oh, an agreement just to put off debt ceiling brinkmanship until after the November elections. That's all we got for $1 trillion. We didn't get any tax hikes for that. That wasn't such a great deal either. You know, and then we have the January 1st opportunity that was missed, and now we have the, you know, they're reversing it, turning it on us here with the defense situation. Not such a good track record. I worked for unions for many years and negotiated scores of contracts, and believe me, if I had that kind of negotiating record, I would have been voted out of office. Okay. Let's turn to Social Security and Medicare. Is Social Security broke? No way. Social Security, since 1986, has generated, along with federal pensions, $2.7 trillion surplus. $2.7 trillion of surplus. I mean, how could it be in trouble? Well, they say we got all these baby boomers, you know, and in the future, down the road, 10 years from now or whatever, we're going to be in trouble. Not so. Not so. We can go a long time with existing benefits, just the way it is, and little tweaks, little tweaks. We can see how little it takes to even shore up, you know, the very minor problems with 77 million baby boomers retiring all at once. Okay. Now, we have $2.7 trillion in the Social Security Trust Fund, built up over the years. However, Congress, in its great wisdom, every year goes into the trust fund, takes that cash out and puts a treasury bond in it. And says, oh, we owe it to ourselves. And I guess that's true, we owe it to ourselves. We can cash out that treasury bond somewhere sometime, but if we cash out that treasury bond, then we're going to have to add that to the debt, you see. So it's not likely they're gonna do it. It's not gone, but boy, it's going to be very hard to get to when we need it. And they're not even talking about doing that, okay. Now, is the country broke? Right? You hear, oh, we're broke, we're living way beyond our means. Well, that's not true either. Look, corporations are sitting on $2 trillion of cash, refusing to invest and create jobs in the U.S. The big banks are sitting on $1.4 trillion in cash. The multinational companies have shuffled off $1.7 trillion in their offshore subsidiaries, which are really accounts in New York, and refusing to bring it back and pay their taxes. We're not broke. It's just that all the money is accumulated at the top, and those at the top won't let go. That's why the tax cuts are the most important thing to them. It's not deficits that are the most important thing to Republicans and business. It's the tax cuts, stupid. That's what it's all about. Protect those tax cuts. And yeah, if we're going to do something about the deficits, make the people pay for the deficits. You know, cut their Social Security, Medicare, education, so on and so forth. So first thing, we're not broke. Second thing, Social Security is not broke. In fact, the top 15% of wage and salary earners are getting a real break with Social Security because the Social Security base has not risen to cover everybody on wage and salary. So they've been getting a break for a long time. Their wages have risen faster than the base of Social Security has been increased. So there's 15% getting a free ride. But that's not even counting all the others who don't make their living from wages and salaries, who make their living from dividends, capital gains, interest, rents, and so forth. They don't pay into Social Security. Okay. Let's talk about real stresses on Social Security, though. It's not broke, but it's not as if there aren't problems. What are the problems? One, when you have so many people unemployed for so long, they're not paying the payroll tax. That's a problem. And when you have wages flat and stagnant for the middle class for so long, that means they're not paying as much into it as well. Jobs and wages are a problem. And why do we have a problem with jobs? Well, because we got free trade and all these high-paying jobs are going offshore. You know, we sent 2.4 million jobs offshore admitted by multinational corporations. Right? The low yields on the treasury bonds that are being held in the Social Security Trust Fund are not generating as much. That's because the Federal Reserve has, you know, lowered interest rates for 5 years. And the fact that we're not creating wages or high-paying jobs anymore. You know, even though we've created 5 million jobs, right? We've heard about that, 5 million. Well, we lost about 5 million too. But even though we're creating 5 million jobs, just look at what's happening with the wages of those jobs. Right? 60% of the jobs we lost since 2008 are high-paying jobs, jobs between $18 and above. 58% of the jobs we created were the lowest-paying jobs. Jobs between $7 and $13 an hour. So we're churning out high-paying jobs, we're churning out union jobs for non-union jobs, high-paying for low-paying, full-time for part-time. Well, that means less money is going into the Social Security Trust Fund. In addition to the lack of job creation, the jobs we are creating are low-pay. That's a problem. That's a problem, okay? One of the long-term problems here. How about stresses on Medicare? Okay, now Medicare's situation is a little bit different. Okay, Medicare, you got to break it down into Part A, hospital, Part B, doctor, Part D, prescription drugs. Okay, Part A, hospital, is not in a problem. That's a separate fund. There's no problem with Part A, hospital. It still has a little surplus, right? Part B, that's doctors. That's a little bit under stress, Part B. Part D, as I said, is the big problem, prescription drugs, because they never pass a tax to pay for it. It's been paying out of deficits all along, and it's costing $50 to $100 billion a year in deficits. Because what did George Bush do? 2005 prescription drug bill, passes it, doesn't pass any tax to pay for it. Right? And it's really a big pharmaceutical subsidy bill is what it is. You know, we're passing the money to the big pharma here, and people are getting a little bit of a benefit, you know, a little trickle down there, the seniors. But there's no price controls, no cost controls. It's illegal to go to Canada and get the same drugs from the same company. You know, businesses can have free trade, but you can't. You know, you can't buy things in other countries just because you want to. Okay, so Part D is a problem. Part B and A are under stress because of runaway healthcare costs, double digit, for most of the past decade. Okay? Nevertheless, despite these problems that exist in A, B, and D, right? The Social Security trustees for Medicare, for the Medicare Trust in 2011 said that all you need to do to fix Part A and Part B is 0.25% increase in the Medicare payroll tax now and 0.25% increase 10 years from now. Instead of paying 1.45, you know, you pay 1.70. Big deal. You wouldn't even see that in your paycheck. That solves all the problems for Part A and Part B Medicare for as long as you can see. And the costs are going to drop in 20 years after all us baby boomers disappear, you see. So we got a little bit of a bulge in cost for 20 years, and then that's going to go down anyway. And all you need is 0.25% now and 10 years from now, and you got all that problem solved. I mean, that's not a crisis, is it? That's not a crisis in Medicare at all. And yeah, you got a little bit of a crisis in Part D prescription drugs, but if you put a 1% tax on that, that would solve that problem, payroll tax. I mean, when you think about it, we provide medical coverage, full medical coverage for almost 50 million people under Medicare for 1.45%. I mean, that's, talk about efficient. You can't find anything more efficient than that. Single payer health care elsewhere in the world, other countries, 10% of their GDP for medical care. What do we pay? 18%. Well, who's making the other 8%? It's the paper pushers. It's the insurance companies. You don't need them in the picture. Okay. What are some of the positions out there? Well, the T-Publicans, Paul Ryan and those people, want to institute vouchers. Right? They sort of backed off on that. Vouchers means the end of Medicare 10 years from now. They want to reduce the cost of living adjustment in Medicare. They want to raise the age in Medicare. No adjustment for inflation in the vouchers. Okay. What about Simpson-Bowles? You know, this commission. You know, I'm really worried because Obama, on January 2nd, when he announced this fiscal cliff settlement, you know, and in announcing it, you know, he kind of praised it, and he said, quote, Medicare is our #1 deficit problem. That worries me when he says Medicare is the #1 deficit problem, because it is not. It is not. I read you those 8 areas that are the problem, and it's not Medicare. And Medicare can be fixed very simply with 0.25%. But yet, the president thinks that's our #1 problem. And again, in his State of the Union address, he said, I like Simpson-Bowles when it comes to, you know, solving Social Security and Medicare. Now, what does Simpson-Bowles propose? You don't know, I'm sure. I'm going to tell you what Simpson-Bowles, all of you folks on Medicare out there, proposes that the president likes. To institute a new $550 a year deductible on Part A, B, whatever. You got Medicare, you're going to pay a $550 deductible. That's Simpson-Bowles. To raise the age of eligibility to 67, 68. Secondly, all right, and to institute only 80% coverage of hospital. You know, like right now you only get 80% coverage on Part B doctors. You got to go get supplemental if you want the other 20%. Well, they want to do the same thing for Part A. Now, when they say, oh, we're not going to cut Medicare benefits, what they're, you know, the politicians are squirming. They're playing games with you. No, they're not going to cut your benefits. They're just going to raise out of pocket what you're going to pay for them. That's what they mean when they say what Joe Biden said last year, I guarantee in the second term we will not cut benefits. No, they won't. They'll make you pay more for what you got. That's what it's all about, you see. In July 2011, when all this debt ceiling thing was going on, remember the big deal, the grand bargain? Well, Obama had said, offered to John Boehner, $700 billion cut in Social Security, $700 billion. And of course, you know, the left-wing Democratic Party choked on that, and there was a big revolt in Congress. He had to back off of it. Well, last November, he offered another $340 billion cut. You know, they're willing to cut Medicare. Right? They're willing to cut Medicare. And on Social Security, they're all in agreement to cut the COLA, and they're all in agreement to raise the age of eligibility. Those two things on Social Security. And, I'm not talking about it, but really make eligibility on Social Security disability insurance much tighter. Too many people, they think, are taking SSDI. Right? Those are the three things they're going to go after on Social Security. And on Medicare, it's Simpson-Bowles. It's deductibles, it's co-pays, and so forth that they're looking at, even though there's not a problem there. Now, where does big business stand on all this? You know, the #1 big business organization is the Business Roundtable, right? The 150 CEOs of the biggest corporations. It's called the Business Roundtable, biggest lobbying powerhouse in the country. They were supporting Obama after the November elections on the tax hikes. You know, that $60 billion toe in the water thing, tax hike, okay? They were supporting him against the Republicans. And that's why Boehner pushed, and they eventually got the Republicans to agree to the $60 billion. By the way, that $60 billion was not only minuscule, but now they didn't have to worry because all the other $4 trillion were permanent. And they even got a good deal and cuts on the inheritance tax and cuts on the alternative minimum tax. So they got a good deal on January 1st. What a sweet deal. No wonder the Republicans voted for it. And then they, you know, said no more tax hikes from now on out. You say, good deal. So where the corporations supported the Democrats and Obama to get that through. It's interesting that that same group, the Roundtable, the CEOs, now flip-flopped, and they're supporting the Republicans' position on spending cuts. They're supporting the Republicans. What are they saying? In a report they issued just a few weeks ago, raise the eligibility age for both Social Security and Medicare to 70. That's what the big businesses want to do, the CEOs. Reduce or end the COLA. Introduce a means test. And we like the idea of vouchers. I mean, that's Paul Ryan. That's the T-Publican position. They totally flipped, and they're totally backing the T-Publicans. Why do you think the T-Publicans are just sitting back and saying, well, let the sequester happen? Because there's no pressure on them anymore. There was pressure on them to raise taxes a little bit, but there's no pressure on them now, and they know it. They're just sitting back. They're playing this game, as I said. You know, the cuts are going to happen. They're going to turn around and reintroduce restoring the defense cuts only. Right? Now, and then the ball's going to be in the Democrats' corner, and they're behind the 8 ball now. And you can see this in the Senate. In the Senate, Lindsey Graham, senator, has proposed here just 2 days ago, oh, let's do a $600 billion spending cut in exchange for loophole closings. $600 billion. Now, $600 billion is exactly the number that the Roundtable CEOs want to cut from Medicare and Social Security. Same number. You see who's carrying the water here. Okay. What are some of the solutions to this situation? First of all, Medicare is not really in a problem. Okay, long term, no. Social Security, definitely not. We got all this surplus, and of course we're drawing the surplus down, right, as we're not creating jobs and raising wages. So there is a long run pressure there, but it's not a crisis. Can be resolved very easily. Okay. First of all, the deficit and the debt. You know, I have a program here, alternative program for economic recovery. And that's also in my book, Obama's Economy, the last chapter of my book. Right? We can solve this $4 trillion deficit thing with one stroke. One stroke. In fact, you get your choice of which one stroke. Right? If we repealed the Bush tax cuts, $4 trillion, it's gone. If we raised the effective tax rate on the income tax, the effective rate to where it was, nominal rate, but effective rate now, in 1980, we would raise $4 trillion, okay, over the next decade. And finally, as I've been proposing, you could raise $4 trillion, and in fact more than $4 trillion, with a financial transactions tax. If we simply taxed, if we taxed stocks at 1% of sales, if we taxed bonds at 1%, if we taxed dividends at derivatives at 1/10 of 1%, and if we taxed retail currency trades, you know, people buying and selling foreign currencies, often with their credit cards, at 1%, you could raise $500 billion a year with that kind of financial transactions tax. Europeans are already introduced it. And, you know, big business and the bankers are apoplectic about all that. In fact, the Treasury Department came out and said, oh, this is bad. Europeans, this is bad stuff. We shouldn't be doing this. And it was very minimal. It was like 1/10 of what I've just described. You know, raise $50 billion over there. Well, we could raise $500 billion. After all, it's a sales tax, isn't it? It's a sales on stock, buying stocks and bonds. We pay 8–9% sales tax. Why shouldn't they pay 1%? And you think that's going to stop them from buying and selling stocks, 1% or 1/10 of 1%? No way. So you can choose either one of those three things and you'd solve this $4 trillion deficit problem with one sweep of the pen. Right? We're not broke, folks. We're not broke. It's just that they's got all the money, you see. And they're squeezing it. They won't let go. And they're making us pay the bill for the mess they created. Okay, so what are some of my proposals, which are also in my program here, on Social Security? Raise the cap to $170,000 a year instead of the $110,000. $170,000, raise the cap. You'd pick up most of that 14% freeloaders, right? That would solve 83% of all the Social Security financing needs for the next century. 83%. Essentially solve the problem. If you raise the payroll tax for Social Security, not Medicare, but Social Security, by 1/4% over the next 5 years, and then 1/4 and 1/4 and 1/4 for 20 years, in other words, every 5 years, 1/4 of 1%, instead of 6.2, you know, pay 6.45, that kind of thing, right? You would solve 100% of all the needs. If you did both of them, you'd have 186% of what you needed. You'd have 86% left over. And you know what you can do with that 86%? You could lower the retirement age to 64. You could lower the retirement age. And more young folks would get jobs. Now, my other proposal is let's nationalize all the 401k plans, because they're not making any money for anybody. Let's nationalize 401k and put it in Social Security and make businesses pay a 1% value-added tax in sales to each other, business-to-business value-added tax. Those three proposals that I've just described to you, if we created jobs at the normal rate we used to as well, and if wages were rising as they used to as well, you would now have enough money to fund single-payer universal health care. Now you could pay for it, you see, simply by those 2 or 3 measures. Okay, what about Medicare? Let me finish up by Medicare. What's the solution to Medicare? Well, I already said the trustees for Part A and B, you know, 1/4 1% now and 1/4% 10 years from now would solve Part A and B. You would have to also put a 1% tax on Part D for prescription drugs, right? And have some sort of price controls on that. Now, what we also should do is why are we allowing people who are making their living off of capital gains and dividends and interest with freeloading here? Why are we allowing that? You know, I mean, why don't we talk about a cap on capital incomes as well? Why shouldn't those people pay into Social Security and Medicare? You know, if you just took 1/2 of a 3.1%, make them pay 3.1%, right? And then if you had a financial transactions tax, well, now you'd have even more money for single payer. If you notice, I'm not talking about cutting anything. And I'm talking about minuscule tax increases here that aren't going to really affect the economy negatively one way or another, the stock or bond markets or whatever, you know. And I'm not even talking about making those folks with $4 or $5 trillion that they're hoarding to put it back into the system. I mean, we could do it all that way, right? We could do it that way, or we could do it by these minimal 0.25% taxes over 10 and 20 years. That would solve the problem. In other words, the problems in Medicare and Social Security are not intractable. They're very small problems financially that have been created because, you know, they passed prescription drugs and didn't pay for it in some ways, or we let the health insurance companies and the healthcare industry run away healthcare costs, and Obamacare is not controlling healthcare costs. That's going to be the thing that does it under eventually. Once you took the public option out, you know, it's the beginning of the end. It won't last the decade. They're going to have to revise that significantly again, okay, because it doesn't control costs. That's the big problem, cost control, health cost control. We haven't really addressed that. But if we address that, you know, and we did something about this upside-down tax system we've created since Ronald Reagan, and went back to something that was more progressive and more fair, and if we just tweaked the tax rates on Medicare and Social Security, you would not only, and add a financial transactions tax, you would not only solve all the problems, but now you could finance Medicare for all. Now, unfortunately, these issues aren't debated anywhere, are they? They're not debated. They won't let this get into the mainstream. I mean, you won't see this. I mean, maybe you watch Bill Moyers, you might see something like this, but you wouldn't see this on Lehrer Report or, you know, my gosh, Fox or anywhere like that, right? We are not broke. It's the money's all bottled up in the rich man's pockets, and they won't let it out. And Social Security is not in a crisis, and even Medicare is not in a crisis, except Part D. And the solutions to this are really very, very simple and not very costly. We're talking about the wrong things. And as long as they keep us distracted talking about the things they want us to talk about, oh, we got to cut, oh, you know, we're in deep trouble, we're going to spin our wheels. Somehow we got to get to the real debate and the real issues, both on the tax side and on the retirement side and on the economic side. Okay, thank you.
The charge I've got tonight is to talk to you about the military side of the budget, but I also want to talk more about what we're going to do about it. First of all, let me say something about PDA. I have not been a member of PDA. I was not paid to say what I'm going to say, but I'll say it anyway. In the time that I've had some reason to have a relationship with PDA as in a political coalitions through U.S. Labor Against the War, it's my observation that it is the single most effective political organization in the country today. And I say that because it has figured out how to do the inside-outside game. Not be owned by the Democrats, but have enough independence to be able to move around the obstacles of democracy. And when they have to go outside, they go outside. So for those who are thinking about PDA, I want to commend you to pay attention. They've done a lot of work with the Progressive Caucus in Congress. The Progressive Caucus, by the way, is the single largest caucus in the Congress, 73 members. Most people don't know that. One of the problems is that it is not the single most well-disciplined caucus in the Congress. If it were, it would be much more effective. And that's something that we've got to work on. When I'm around PDA, especially when I'm around national leadership, Tim Carpenter in particular, I always can count on learning something I didn't know about something that's going to happen inside that he's got notice of. that no one else does. And so tonight, I'm going to share with you something that you don't know and that most of the people in the country don't know, but they will shortly, about what the Progressive Caucus is planning. Some of you know that the Progressive Caucus had, over the last couple of years, a budget. I think one year they called it the People's Budget, right? Another was the budget for all. And what they tried to do with the budget is to show more responsible ways in which you can cut things that should be cut in order to save the things that shouldn't. And cutting the military was a piece of that. Well, they've decided to scrap that. And this year they're coming in with a budget which is specifically based upon no cuts to anything that affects people like us. The only cuts they're proposing are for things like subsidies to the energy industry or big agribusiness or big pharma. No cuts to social programs. They're making the primary objective to bring the unemployment rate down to 5% in 3 years, and they say they can do it. Now, I haven't seen the details yet. It'll come out in an embargoed form next week, and it will be released to the world the following week. They tell me that they have been assured that the Republicans are going to let them bring it to a vote. And what that's going to do is it's going to put every Democrat on the spot. We're going to find out who's with the people and who's not. People like Dianne Feinstein, for example. Of course, this is a House bill, so it will need to get into the Senate in order to test Feinstein, but Pelosi is certainly going to have to be tested. And there are a lot of people who parade themselves as progressives who need to be tested, who talk a good talk, but when they come to vote, they don't always walk the walk. So I've got a bunch of different things I want to do tonight, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Jack said, we're not broke. And that's true. The country is not broke. But the system is broken. Democracy is broken. And we've got to do something about that. There's no crisis, but there is a crisis. It's a manufactured crisis. It was a crisis created specifically in order to justify imposing an austerity plan on the American people. A plan like what's being imposed on Greece or Spain. Except that the Greeks and the Spanish have the good sense to protest against it. And Americans have been lulled into a kind of complacency and inactivity that we've got to figure out how to overcome. We, and I speak now of the progressives from, the slightly left of center to the far left, our views today are the majority views of the American people. We are squarely in the mainstream of political thinking of the American people. It's those politicians in Washington who are the extremists. They're the fringe element. And we've got to talk to people about that. That they are working for different paymasters. And they're dancing the tune that the people who pay the piper, call the tune. Well, that's the case. The fact that a member of Congress, from the day they are inaugurated or sworn into office to the day of the next election, they've got to raise thousands of dollars every single day in order to be competitive in any races where there's any kind of a contest. That's the system that's broken. And that's going to require a constitutional amendment that makes it clear once and for all that corporations are not people. And they do not have the same rights as people. They don't have the right of free speech. If you look a little bit into history, you'll find out that corporations used to be very narrowly prescribed for a single purpose, and when the purpose was filled, like building the Erie Canal, the corporation is supposed to be dissolved. Well, we have corporations that today, they cover the world, literally in terms of their markets, but they cover the world also in terms of their products. General Electric used to be known for electrical products. It's not. It's a bank now, GE Finance. And its investments range over the entire economy, wherever they can make a buck. The former chief executive of GE had a policy. We will be number 1 or number 2 in our markets, or we'll get out of them. And so they're in this kind of ruthless objective to be number 1 or number 2, and they're pretty good at it. So the real crisis that we're facing is a crisis of austerity. We've got to make it clear to people that you cannot get to Prosperity Street by taking the austerity road. It doesn't go there. Very simply, it will not take us to economic revival. It will not take us to full employment. It will not overcome poverty. It will not reduce inequality. And these are the things that when you ask the American people, these are the things they care about. And that's why we're in the mainstream. There's a new survey that just was done. Blind poll. This is on Common Dreams. What they did is they took the provisions of each of the plans, the administration's plan, the Republican plan, and the Progressive Caucus plan, which in terms of sequester is called the Balancing Act. It's H.R. 505, which basically nullifies sequestration and in its place puts a number of measures that go in the other direction. They didn't tell people what these things were in terms of their partisan, but just the ideas. This is this proposal, and this is what happened. Overwhelming majority of people favored the Progressive Caucus plan. That's number 1. But the poll found, in addition to beating the House Republican plan and the Senate Democrats plan, more than half respondents supporting the Balancing Act, the Progressive plan, compared to sequestration, and a fifth of the respondents were opposed. More than half were Republicans. When you talk to people and remove the party labels and get down to the values that people care about, you can move them to do things they would not do. This is not about the best ideas. This is about basic values that people have. And people will be drawn to good ideas that reflect their values. And so we need to have a values discussion with our neighbors, with our families, with our coworkers. I'm going to go through some numbers, and this may bore the tears out of you. So if it does, stop me. But I want to give you some talking points for how to talk to people about the military budget. First of all, let's get down to some the language we use. Drop the term defense spending. There's nothing defensive about it, right? The Pentagon is not about national defense. Even the term military spending doesn't quite reflect what we want to get at. When you test these phrases with people, the one that they respond to most viscerally is Pentagon spending. They understand that the Pentagon is an unaccountable runaway bureaucracy that is not working for them. And so change your language. If you've been talking about military spending and defense spending, talk about Pentagon spending, even though we know there are elements in the military program of the country, like the nuclear budget, which are not in the Pentagon. We know that. It's in the Department of Energy. Homeland Security is not in the Pentagon. But in terms of communicating with people, this is a way of kind of connecting with them to something that they understand intuitively. We have 963 generals and admirals in the country right now, line officers in top command. Each of those carries with them a budget of about $1 million a year in their retinue and benefits. That's the largest ratio of top brass to soldiers, to grunts, in modern history. More than during the Second World War, more than the Korean War, more than the Vietnam War, and certainly more than the Iraq and Afghan wars. Today, we're carrying a lot of people whose job it is, basically, is to keep the arms industry happy. That's what the Pentagon is all about. The Pentagon is simply a brokerage firm for the arms industry that allows them to broker their weapons for your money. We have to talk to people about national security in a different frame. National security is not about how big your military is, how many carriers you have, what missiles you have, which of the latest fighter planes you have, or how many people under arms. That's not about national security. National security is when people have a home, an income, decent retirement, the right to education. Those are the things that give people a sense of security. So we need to broaden the definition of national security and redefine the functions of security. If we put a fraction of the money we now squander on weapons we don't need, for enemies that no longer exist, for wars we cannot fight, if we put that into aggressive diplomacy, into economic and education aid, into health research and development to wipe out diseases that afflict developing countries that they cannot afford to treat or even research themselves. If we put money into those things, we would raise our security, our national security, immeasurably. And we would not have as many people eager to retaliate for things that we do to them. If we closed some of the 1,000 foreign bases around the world that we carry, over 200 bases in Germany. Now, explain to me which enemy we're defending against in Germany and how the German people cannot defend themselves. Explain that. Explain that, because the Germans are in NATO and they're in Afghanistan right now, fighting. They have a military. In England, in Spain, in France, we have military installations. If you look at a map, and we have one actually, a picture of a map that shows the lines to all of the bases in the world, it's like a bunch of spaghetti. And most of those bases are in places where the people do not want them, where they are associated with regimes that repress them, like Colombia. So if we cut the military budget to remove those bases, we would immediately increase our national security by reducing instability and conflict in the world. If we were not the largest weapons manufacturers and gun pushers, gun runners in the world, we sell more to more places than anyone else. If we weren't peddling that crap, people wouldn't have the means to kill one another because they get it from us, overwhelmingly. More than any other country, they get it from us. We are now investing $400 billion in the F-35 fighter, the 21st century fighter. The F-35 was designed for the Cold War to fight the Russians, or at the time, the Soviets. Soviets don't exist. It's a weapon that doesn't work. They've just grounded all the F-35s because of flaws in their design. The F-22 is a plane that routinely kills its pilots because of malfunctions. And they've put a new restriction that F-22s aren't allowed to fly more than 30 miles from their bases because of fear that they won't get back. We're paying for these things. We're paying for this. This is simply to secure the bank accounts of the arms industry. That's the national security that it is designed to take care of. The profit margins of the arms makers. We spend 57% of our discretionary budget on the military. Now, what's a discretionary budget? There are two categories in our budgeting system. There's mandatory. Mandatory is things that are dictated by law, like Social Security. Discretionary spending is what Congress votes on and fights about every year. Okay? 57%, 57 cents out of every dollar that you give the government goes to the Pentagon, to the arms makers. Since 2002, that budget, the Pentagon budget, has increased by 35%. All other domestic discretionary spending has gone up only 8%. So the military spending is advancing at a rate 4 times the rate of all other expenses to the budget. And Jack said, you know, one of the contributors to our current crisis is military spending, doing it on the credit card. If you add in the cost of the wars, it's 48%, 6 times the rate of increase of the domestic budget. We spend, in the world, for the entire world, we spend 42% of all military spending in the world. Almost half. Almost more than the rest of the world combined. We spend more than the next 14 countries in rank, and some of those, by the way, are our allies in NATO, but including China and Russia and any one of a number of the so-called rogue states that Bush used to talk about. In fact, if you put them all together, the so-called rogue states, 1% of the global total. We could cut our military budget in half, and we would still spend more than any other country. We spend 5 times as much as the second place, which is the Chinese. 5 times. We have 11 aircraft carrier groups. 11. There is no country in the world that has more than 2. Soviets have 1. Russians, excuse me, have 1. Chinese have 2. Those carrier groups are not defending us against anything. Those carrier groups are what we call projecting force. Projecting U.S. force on other people. Which is to say, if you don't do what we tell you to do, or what's in our interest not being your interest, but the interests of investors, if you don't do what we say, you will have to deal with our 11 carrier groups. It's very plain. The message is out there. The Iranians get that message every single day. We hear a lot about jobs. Well, you know, the military produces a lot of good jobs. It's a reasonable argument, except it's not the whole argument. There was a study done by the Perry Institute at the University of Massachusetts. They said, if you take $1 billion and spend it on the military, how many jobs will it create? If you take the same $1 billion and spend it on education, or on health care, or on protecting the environment, sustainable technologies, how many jobs will it create? And what came out was the military creates fewer jobs per $1 billion than any one of those others, including tax cuts to spur consumer spending, which creates more jobs. And then they said, well, okay, but these jobs are really good jobs. And they did a study of what the jobs pay. And when they factored it all out, with the exception of the medical area, which has a lot of very low-paid people in it, the military paid worse than the others, on average. So if the study is accurate, you have to take the reverse. When they talk about cutting, what will do the most or the least damage? Well, the converse is, if you cut $1 billion of spending from education, you will destroy more jobs than if you cut $1 billion from the military. And then you hear the argument, well, but those are a lot of good union jobs. That's true. But if you look at the actual activity of the corporations, you will see that as the corporations have received bigger and bigger contracts, they are actually reducing the size of their workforce. And much of that work is going out of the country, even though by law, the prime contractor's got to be American. But much of the assembly is it's like the automobiles. You know, you get your engine from Mexico and your transmission from Korea and all that stuff. I work in the labor movement. I've spent my entire adult life in the labor movement. I organized my first union when I was 18. I'm now older than that by a fair amount. And I am sensitive to the fact that there are lots of people and communities that depend on these contracts. But when you look at the country, there are 3 states that have the overwhelming majority of military contracts. They've spread the rest around, but they really account for a very small percentage of the economies of most states. And you probably can figure out what two of those states are. One of them is our own. What's another?
Texas.
Texas. And the third? Virginia. Those three states, the overwhelming majority of contracts. So here's the plan. This is my plan. You know, Jack has his plan, I've got my plan. If we took a small percentage of what we now throw away on these arms we don't need for enemies that no longer exist, and put that into an account that would guarantee every defense industry or military sector or Pentagon contractor worker that they will not become the victims of society's desire to demilitarize the economy. Now, what do we do? Well, some of you know that when a corporate executive is hired or transferred, the company will pay lavishly. That, you know, if they've got a mansion in New York and they're going to buy a bigger mansion in California, the company often will buy the mansion in New York and sell it so that their executive doesn't take any kind of a loss. They will subsidize all kinds of things for executives. Well, why not for workers? We should say to any worker who needs to leave the state to travel to another state, who's displaced because of the end of a contract, that you will not be harmed. We will see to it that your house is sold for its real value, and you will receive transfer allowances, and we will help you on the other end if there's a job waiting for you where your skills are needed. But a lot of people don't want to leave, and that's reasonable. Why should they? Their families are rooted. Their social relationships are here or there. We should say to them, we will develop plans for your factory. You will develop plans for your factory. You will participate in developing a plan for your factory about what the technology that is in place today can be used for that's not military. So if you're producing missiles, could you produce bullet trains instead? You know, if you're a machinist and you use a computer-guided lathe or some other machining tool, that's a universal tool that can be used for anything. It can produce anything. It's not peculiar to producing weapons. So studies should be done. We should require that every military contract that is let has built into it, paid by the company from the profits, a study about what will happen to that factory when the contract ends. And the workers should participate in that plan with the community. Okay, but there are some plants you just cannot convert. Reasonable. We should pay to send those workers back to school, to retrain them. We're supposed to do that for vets, although we don't do very well, but we're supposed to. Why not veterans of the private sector, of the industry? Well, I'm 55 years old. I've worked in this plant for 30 years. I'm not going to learn a new trade at 55. Good. We will let you take early retirement, and we will pay the difference between what you get from your current plan and what you would get if you waited to 65 or 67, whatever the normal retirement age is of the plan. We will make up the difference. Have a good retirement. Let's hire some young people and give them jobs. There is so much money in the military budget that we can do all of these things and still have money, lots of money left over. Our job is to convince the unions and the workers in the industry that rather than waiting to become roadkill on the plan to demilitarize the economy, they should become proactive in this cause and actually participate in redesigning their industries. I am sure, I am absolutely confident that the workers who produced the ovens in which the Jews were killed in Germany would much rather have produced something else, but they had very little choice. We need to give people choices. If sequestration goes into effect, we've heard all of these predictions about calamity that will befall us, and particularly from military contractors. The world will come to an end as we know it. And they're panicking people who work for them. But the truth is that for all of these weapons makers, they have 2- and 3-year backlogs of funds that are already allocated for weapons that are in the pipeline. And they're going to continue making those. That gives us a 1 to 3 and sometimes longer years to figure out how to make this transition without threatening anybody's job. But there's another source of money. The Pentagon, a couple of months ago, was sitting on $130+ billion in unconsigned resources, money that had already been budgeted, that they haven't spent and it's not allocated for anything. When they realized that this sequestration might actually happen, they began spending money like crazy, buying everything that they, what did you say you wanted for Christmas? Go buy it, right? And they managed to spend it down at the rate of about $1 billion a day, or excuse me, several million dollars a day. They spent it down to 105 billion plus. There's $105 billion. Now, remember, sequestration is supposed to be about $85 billion. Take it out of the Pentagon account. We don't have to sequester anything. There's 85 billion plus sitting in that account unspent. Recover the money. A congressional commission on wartime contracting did a study. And last fall, they reported an estimated $31 to $60 billion in Defense Department waste and fraud related to Iraq and Afghanistan. Millions of dollars simply disappeared. I don't know if you remember it, but I saw the photographs in Iraq in particular, where they had huge crates of money. Pallets with money stacked up, wrapped, right? That they offloaded. And the idea was that they were going to give money to every one of the field commanders to buy off the local population. And they did use it for that. But millions and millions of dollars simply went missing. Waste, fraud, and abuse? Yes. Yesterday we had a national series of demonstrations called Pull the Pork. And there's a lot of pork to pull. The trouble is that doesn't tell the whole story. Pulling the pork is the easy part. That's the low-hanging fruit. The harder part is changing the policy that creates the pork. We need to demilitarize American foreign policy if we want to demilitarize our economy. We have to change our priorities so that our first recourse is not to send the Marines or Special Forces or the 11th Fleet, but to engage diplomatically, to bring in mediation, to go to the United Nations, to work in a sincere way to resolve conflicts before they happen, or when they're young enough to solve easily. And if, as I said, we put as much energy and resources into that, we wouldn't need all those Marines. Your tax dollars allow the Pentagon annually to spend $500 million on marching bands. Marching bands, $500 million a year. Your tax dollars allow the Pentagon to operate or own 233 golf courses around the world and 3 world-class resorts, including a ski resort in the Bavarian Alps. That's your money. So don't tell me that we can't cut that budget without impairing our security. There's no question about it. And cutting that budget is the first step to changing the nation's priorities to put jobs ahead of jails, to spend more on education than we spend on incarceration. Because we're living with the consequences of the militarization of our foreign policy here at home. Our police departments are being militarized. Now they're even asking for drones. Next, they're going to want to know, well, can we assassinate really bad people here on our soil? They do such a good job over there, right? When you, if you were downtown in Oakland during Occupy and you saw the police response, what you saw was a paramilitary or a military response. Every police department has a budget from the Pentagon to acquire weapons that are used by the military. And they can apply for grants if they don't have money in their budgets from the Pentagon. So not only are we hiring in our police forces people who got their killer training in the service, but we are now giving them the guns they used to kill overseas so that they can kill here at home. We have an arsenal of 8,500 nuclear weapons. That's enough to incinerate the world many times over. Now, how many times do we have to exterminate the planet that requires us to have all those weapons? Assuming that we needed any at all, which we don't. But let's give them the argument for a moment. Look at what the North Koreans have been able to accomplish with a couple of nuclear weapons. They've kept us at bay for decades, right? Why do we want to stop the Iranians? Because all they need is one to change the politics of the Middle East. We don't need 8,500 to show we're badasses. We all know we're badasses. We incinerated 2 cities in Japan to prove it. We incinerated Dresden in Germany to prove it. Those were war crimes for which nobody was held accountable. They were given medals. So we know we're badasses. We don't need all those nuclear weapons. The Obama administration has proposed to modernize the nuclear arsenal and its delivery systems, and therefore has allocated $18 billion a year for the next 10 years for that purpose. Instead of reducing the size of that arsenal, they're going to modernize it, make it more lethal. In order to deliver that lethality, aside from the missiles that we have 71 nuclear submarines. That's 7 times more than China and twice as many as Russia. They have nothing to do with our national defense. The U.S. has 4 times the number of attack helicopters as the rest of the world combined. I'm going to share with you some numbers, and so that you don't need to write it down or remember it. I made copies. If you would hand those around. The people of San Francisco this year, or excuse me, last year, in 2012, paid for the 2 wars, and by the way, the war in Iraq's not over. You're still paying for it, and the Iraqis are still dying for it. There's a whole bunch of them floating around. It'll get around to you. You paid $361.2 million last year for those wars, the taxpayers of the city and county of San Francisco. You paid $1.6 billion of the Pentagon's budget last year. You contributed $55.9 million to that nuclear arsenal in the Energy Department. And Homeland Security got $153 million of your money. That's $2.17 billion from this city alone. How many schools are going to close? How many libraries have short hours? How many streets go unrepaired? How many public safety officers are they short? I just want to say 2 words about the organizations I work for, and then I'll stop. U.S. Labor Against the War was formed 10 years ago in January 2003, before the war began. We are now an organization of approaching 200 labor organizations across the country, including 8 labor federations, state federations, more than 24 labor councils, and innumerable local unions, large and small. But if you belong to a union and you're not sure whether your union belongs to U.S. law, I want to talk to you, okay? You need to become part of solving the problem by engaging with your coworkers and your union leadership. We began a couple of years ago something called the New Priorities Network, with 75 organizations to start. It's up over 90. And these are groups all over the country who are doing exactly this work of changing the priorities of the nation. And they're not anti-war groups alone. They come from anti-poverty groups, human services organizations, environmental groups, all kinds of people. They share a common interest in cutting the military budget. And just a few months ago, we started the Jobs Not Wars campaign. And we had a petition, many of you may have signed it, that we delivered a couple of weeks ago with 35,000 signatures. It was endorsed by 175 organizations across the country, and we have resolved to continue because the job's not done. On Sunday in Oakland at the California Nurses Association, the campaign, the New Priorities campaign, which is the Bay Area expression of this, will have a meeting. You're more than welcome to come. It's 2000 Franklin, 20th and Franklin, near the 19th Street BART station at 1:30. So my challenge to you is don't keep this a secret. Start talking to people about it, get them angry, and then channel that anger into something constructive. Thank you.
Normally we have lots of questions, and I think because of the time, how many questions, Dolores, do you think we can do?
Oh, how about 6?
6 questions, all right. Please stand, give your name, and address whichever gentleman you want to ask the question to. Yes, gentleman in the back.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One is on dealing with the extent of the problem this country is facing, and it relates to the military side. I'm a veteran, so I have a question. I heard part of something on a radio talk show that an admiral who was in charge as the comptroller, the guy who takes care of the books, in the beginning of the President George W. Bush's administration. Rumsfeld, I guess, was the Secretary of Defense. And allegedly, when he took over and looked at the books, he found he couldn't find accountability for $2 trillion plus of money they don't know what it was spent on. Now, I don't know if that's an urban legend, apocryphal. I know there's a lot of missing money and missing accounting in the Pentagon. So if this is true, or even something approaching it, then another issue we have to talk about in all this thing is the C word, meaning corruption. Okay? Like a big stick up of the American people by the Pentagon, the brokers. So the question is that true? The other question is, what do we do about these attacks on our social safety net? Medicare that's come down the pipe, Medicaid, Social Security, and the attacks by robbing us for all the military machine.
Thank you.
Short answer. I can't tell you whether it's true or not, but I can tell you this. 22 years ago, they passed a law that said every department of the government has to be audited every year. The Pentagon has never been audited. Never. In those 22 years. So the reality is that probably it's true, and if it's not, it's true for other reasons, you know, for other causes. What we're going to do about it? What I talked about, getting involved in organizations like PDA and the campaign and organizing our neighbors and going to, by the way, this afternoon, a delegation went to meet with the staff of Dianne Feinstein to deliver this message, and we did. And they said they would see to it she got the message tomorrow. The trouble is that Dianne Feinstein's husband is deeply invested in the military-industrial complex, and so it's going to take more than delivering a message. There needs to be organizations around the state who start going after her and demanding accountability.
As far as Social Security is concerned, I think we ought to go back to the origins of Social Security. How did it start? It started in the depths of the Great Depression when people formed Social Security clubs, independent of both political parties across the country. And it grew and it grew till there were clubs everywhere, and everyone was demanding some sort of retirement. FDR initially opposed it, but the clubs got so popular, and there's so many of them, and they demanded something be done that the Democrats then had to embrace the idea of Social Security. That's how it began, a grassroots movement. And if you want to save it, I think you got to have an independent grassroots movement of Social Security clubs once again. And the only thing that politicians listen to is when you're going to take their job from them. I am not as optimistic that writing letters and petitioning and going and talking to these representatives is going to get you much, because they're already thinking how to get away with it on both sides of the political aisle there. So I'm not as aggressively as the others. But until you threaten to throw them out of office, you know, with some alternative political movement, whatever the heck that is, they're not going to listen to you. They'll listen to the loss of their jobs. That's the only thing in the end they'll listen to. But I think there's got to be a grassroots movement of Social Security Club. Let's start from the beginning.
Okay, over here.
Camera and microphone at the same time. This is a question related to what you both just said. How do we light fires under people to make them act? I've never seen the level of complacency and just brain deadness as exists in this country. When you look at Greece, you look at Spain, you look at Europe, these people are acting. What is going to make the United States citizens act? Do you have any thoughts about that? Thank you.
Great question.
Oh, my name is Carol Harvey.
Thank you, Carol.
Well, you know, if you look in Southern Europe, they're really going after people with a hatchet jar. I mean, it's really, really severe. That's an oppression going on in Southern Europe, across the southern tier.
You're talking about Italy.
Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, you know. Their austerity is being done with an axe, real quick. Here, politicians are much more clever. It's the old frog in the pot, turn up the heat little by little. Austerity, American style. They're much smarter in this country on how they're going about it. They're chipping away. You know, they're not saying, let's get rid of Social Security, privatize it overnight. No, they're chipping away here and there, little by little. And that's a lot more difficult to make people realize that, you know, there is just as big a threat to these safety net programs. But again, I think the big problem, see, I think American people are not dumb. I think they're really pissed off. Okay? I really think the level of discontent is very deep. The problem here is no one has a vehicle to turn to express their political frustration. That's the problem. And that's the answer, I think. Somehow, that kind of movement and alternative political organization has to be created. And then I think the people would flood to it. I really do. I don't think American people are dumb or laid back or spoiled or anything. I think they look around and say, well, where can I do something? And they can't see where.
Occupy was killed. What about that?
You know how you open the paper and you see an ad about the miracle pill that's going to make you look 23 and slim? Or that's going to cure your arthritis or your hearing or whatever problem you've got? They're all bogus, and most people with common sense figure that out. And so if I sat here and said, I've got the answer to your question, I'd be selling you those same sugar pills. What I want to do is turn it around and say, ask yourself, what brought me here tonight? Why did I come here tonight? You had a reason. You were motivated. So the question then is to figure out with people what will bring them to something. Now, you may be more comfortable with coat pink sitting in somebody's office or doing something flamboyant. Or you may be more conservative, more reserved, and would rather write letters and call members of Congress. The issue isn't what's right or wrong, it's do something. Do a lot of it. And organizations like this will begin to channel that energy. PDA put a huge ground operation in play in support of progressive candidates around the country and made the difference in a number of races. Because people saw an opportunity to elect somebody they could believe in. The problem then is holding them accountable. So that's the second part of our challenge. There is no magic formula. I start by asking people, what do they care about? You know, what concerns you? What are your values? What are the things that are important to you? And then, what are you doing about it? Sometimes you have to challenge people to get off their duffs. And let's not forget also, people now are working 2 and 3 jobs, trying to cobble together a living to pay inflated prices for everything. They're exhausted. They're not going to come and sit down in front of Mayor Kwan's office in Oakland and you know, set up a tent and stay there for 3 days or 4 weeks. So we have to find things that they are willing to do. Another thing that's highly underrated is letters to the editor. Few of them, very few of them get printed. But when the papers start getting lots of letters on some topic, more of those get printed. May not be your letter, but it'll be somebody else's. Those of you who are writers, op-eds. Begin developing op-eds. If you can't get them published in the newspapers, put them on a blog. Put them on your Facebook page, if you've got that. Start using the tools that you're using now for other things to do political organizing.
All right, I see from the back that we have to get ready to close up, and I want to give everyone an opportunity to come up and take a look at the materials that have been brought. You can ask your question, right?
I'd like to ask it publicly.
Okay. Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah.
2 more, and that's it.
Yeah,
Two more,
because I've been waiting.
Thank you.
You said 6.
My concern is about real homeland security. Now, you'll notice the Newtown shootings and the serial shootings that are going on are all domestic in nature. They're not external. And the thing about it, what we really have to develop now is safe communities, safe households, safe work sites. Too many people work under bosses that are bullies. And we have to stop that. And we have to make sure that women can walk the streets at night safely, as well as elderly people. And we need new universities and medical schools and law schools to train people. This is real homeland security. It's not what we have to die for, it's what we have to live for. And I'd like to thank the 2 presenters. Excellent presentation.
Thank you so much.
Don, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick one.
Okay. Don?
For me to be persuasive with people about the defense budget, I know they're going to ask, okay, how much do you think the defense budget should be? What do you think the weapon systems would be? Who do you think the threats are? You haven't addressed that, maybe next time. So when you ask us to be persuasive, you have to be persuasive.
That's fair.
I know, Mr.
That's fair. And if you were willing to stay here for another couple hours, I might be more persuasive.
You've already stayed for a long time.
But the answer is that there are a number of studies that have been done that looked at every one of the spending lines of the Pentagon budget and looked at what ought to be cut, what could be cut without impairing national security. There's a report available. You know, I can probably fish it up for you if I had a computer in front of me. So it's not like this is a mystery. You know, we do need to do a better job of giving you those tools so that you can have that conversation. And you're right about that. But the answers are there. It's not like there isn't an answer. Starting out, you could take the F-35 and the F-22 and turn them into scrap metal, and we would be a lot safer and it would be cheaper. Right? It wouldn't impair our defense.
So how many F-16s and F-18s would you be favored for?
So to start with, you leave them alone.
Okay, the same numbers we have.
Yeah, I mean, there are some things that you're not going to cut all at once. Let's be politically real now, you know.
That's what I'm asking, right?
we're not going to be able to go in and eliminate all the nukes overnight. We want to be able to start eliminating some of them. By the way, we're obligated by treaties to do that. We're just not honoring our treaty obligations. So we can talk to people about realistic things that they can identify as wasteful that we don't need, like the bases, right? I mean, you can talk about those things as things where we can save lots of money without affecting our national safety, not national security, our safety, real safety, one iota.
Just a brief comment. When it comes to the deficit, there's only really three things you can focus on. One is you can raise taxes, raise revenue, in various ways. You can cut defense, right? Or you can cut entitlements. The rest of it is minor amount. You'll never get to that 4 trillion or whatever your number is. So I would say, since this is about Social Security and Medicare, just remember, to the extent you do not cut defense, you will have to cut entitlements. That's the big trade-off. Or raise taxes, one or the other. And remember, corporations and wealthy folks, corporations are sitting on over $3 trillion of cash, doing nothing with it except investing it offshore or in financial securities. And I hadn't said anything about the $4 or $5 trillion U.S. wealthy investors have stuck away in 27 offshore tax havens and won't bring it back. You know, that's another $4 trillion. That's what I mean. The money is there. So you either get those taxes, or you cut defense, or you cut Social Security. That's the formula.
When the Progressive Caucus issues their budget, there will be that kind of detail also in their budget. Because they have to, you have to make very specific proposals. How you're going to create jobs, what you're going to spend it on, that kind of thing. So there will be more of those answers.
The problem with defense, cutting defense and so forth, is a complicated long-term deal. The threat to Social Security and Medicare is 2013. Okay?
Didn't we have, that's it. That's it, Art. I'm sorry. But you can come up and talk to these gentlemen. Can we give them a round of applause one more time? Thank you.